All right, it looks like we're recording.
Yep, go right ahead.
All right, well, welcome everyone to the August version of Salsa Society. I'm really thrilled that you could all make it out, and we have two great speakers today. Lisa Chase presenting on agritourism, Scour or Savior, and then Patricia Stokowski, Imaginaries, Recreation, Tourism, and Rural Places. Imaginaries of Recreation, Tourism, and Rural Places. I should learn to read. So yeah, thanks all again for being here. This is a 1-hour Salsa Society seminar, and really we're here to cross-pollinate. It's a good forum for research and education across CALs, but also outside. And our goals really are not only cross-pollination, but really to weave some networks among us, and possibly with also the out-of-the-box planning sessions yield some grant proposals if we're lucky. And I want to give some thanks to Chris Callahan here and Andrew May and as part of the organizing team. And I guess Kathy is in there too, but we've had a lot of others help us along the way. So just so you know, before we jump in, we've got these two seminars that go the first and second Thursday of the month generally, and then we'll finish on the quarterly with a brainstorm session and with emerging topics. And we're looking at many good topics coming up in the future. But with that, I am just going to close out because we'll end with that slide. And we'll get going here. So without, I'm not actually going to formally introduce the candidates, or excuse me, the presenters, because they will more or less introduce themselves. But Lisa Chase is excuse me, I'm trying to multitask. I've got to find your, let me just get this up and then I will turn it over. Okay. Yeah, this is, I believe, correct. Nope, sharing is paused. I'm sorry. Thanks for your patience here. I had this a minute ago. Someone tell a joke. I have lost what I just had up.
How about while you focus on getting that up, I'll just kind of start jumping into things. Does that work, Hans?
Sure. And I'm sorry about this.
Not Lisa.
And I'll start off by saying that Patricia and I conspired to come up with difficult words in our titles just so we could throw you off, Hans, and make things more challenging. And now we're conspiring to mess up the screen share. So while Hans is getting that going, I just want to thank Hans, Andrew, and Chris for the opportunity to share a little bit of my work on agritourism and tourism here today. And I did, with Hans's encouragement, I intentionally picked a provocative title, Agritourism, Scourge or Savior, to acknowledge that there's pros and cons, there's good and bad pieces to agritourism and tourism in general. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that is, what the pros and cons are, and maybe we'll do a vote on the end of whether it is a scourge or a savior. So I'll keep jumping in, Hans.
Yeah, can you see that now?
Yes, it's up.
Okay. Great. I didn't have that.
So Lisa and Hans, this is Chris. I'm sharing. So Lisa, just give me a nod when you want me to advance.
Oh, okay. Good behind the scenes teamwork there. So So actually, I'll start on this one. So I first heard the term agritourism, quote unquote, agritourism, 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago, when I was applying for my current job here on the faculty at UVM Extension as a natural resources specialist. And I was reading through a very long, very vague job description, talking about lots of different things. And the word popped out at me because I thought, what is this agritourism thing? I've never heard of that. And I asked around a little bit, and most people hadn't heard about it. And those I spoke to who had heard about it gave a whole bunch of different answers. Fortunately, some of the people I met during my job interview, and then later after I ended up working at UVM, really knew what agritourism was. And these were Vermont farmers who had had the opportunity to travel to Europe, to Ireland and Italy in particular, on trade missions with Senator Leahy. And that's where they first had a chance to learn about agriturismo, as it's called in Italy, and experience it firsthand. And those farmers returned to Vermont from Europe with a vision for agritourism as community development, not only for their farms, but also for their communities. And they understood the ripple effect of successful agritourism that can create jobs well beyond the farm families that are open to visitors, and that can contribute to farm viability in very meaningful ways. Could I have the next slide, Chris? But not everyone understood that. Certainly 20 years ago, when people were wondering, what is this agritourism thing? So one of the farmers who introduced me to agritourism is Beth Kennett, who is with Liberty Hill Farm in Rochester, dairy farm. And many of you I know her through her and her family's work with their dairy farm, and also being open to visitors. And she worked with my predecessor in Extension, Bob Townsend, literally knocking on doors or farm stands, fields, barns, to let farms who were open to visitors in different ways know that they were doing this thing, and it had a name, agritourism. And it was marketable, and it was really popular in Europe, and they could work together to bring visitors to Vermont. However, at the time, both the Department of Ag at the time, now the Agency of Ag, and the Department of Tourism were completely uninterested. In fact, were discouraging about it. And I remember Beth telling me how she talked to the Commissioner of Tourism about this great thing in Europe, agriturismo, and he told her, it's never going to work in Vermont. Our tourists don't want to get their shoes dirty. Clearly, he had never hiked the long trail, because that's all about getting muddy. And in agriculture, a lot of the lead folks working in the Department of Ag at the time thought of agritourism as a distraction from farming, as something that takes away from farming. And it can indeed be that. I mean, let's face it, agritourism still has plenty of challenges and plenty of reasons not to love it. Can we go to the next slide? One of the concerns about one of the downsides of agritourism is just the name tourism. I mean, a lot of people don't like tourists, as you can see in the slide. Not even where they're saying this could be a lovely place if only there were less lousy tourists. Even the tourists don't really like the tourism. And there's a saying that a lot of people use in rural tourism when we talk about tourism as a powerful force. Some people compare tourism to a fire. If you tend it carefully, it can warm your home, it can bake your bread, it can heat your soup and cook your dinner. But if you let that fire get out of control, it can burn down your house. And we've seen, all of us, mostly outside of Vermont, but in certain communities, we've seen the tourism get out of control and really have negative impacts on the community, so that the people in that community can no longer afford to live there, and the community may not even be recognizable. It becomes a tourist attraction with a very different culture, landscape, environment, and economy. Could we go on to the next slide? So this concept of agritourism, though, which really is about visiting farms, and this tradition of traveling and gathering on farms and ranches has probably been around in some shape or form since the beginning of agriculture, most likely. Native American tribes traveled long distances for planting and harvest feasts and ceremonies, as well as sugaring, and European immigrants to the US brought their own traditions, often centered around gatherings on farms. In the 1800s, migrants would traveling west, would spend the night at a farmhouse in exchange for payment or helping with chores. And as the US has become increasingly urbanized, families living in cities would visit farms to escape the summer heat of the city and learn about farming and rural life. And oftentimes these same families would go to the same farms year after year. So spending time on farms and celebrating agriculture was a regular part of life for most Americans 100 years ago, when 70% of this country was employed in agriculture. Today, less than 2% of US employment is in farms. So just a few generations ago, most people had some sort of personal farming connection through families, friends, neighbors. And nowadays, visiting a farm or visiting a farm is often a special occasion in most of the US. And, you know, I think here in Vermont, in Vermont, many of us, especially those of us in CALS, are still in the College of Ag and Life Sciences, are still very connected to farming, have your own farms, go to CSAs, go to farmer markets. I think we sometimes forget how disconnected most of the US population is from agriculture. Next slide, please. So in about 40 years ago in Europe, this term agritourism came into being in Italy when incentives were provided for farms to maintain their agricultural buildings and their farms and the working landscape in an effort to keep people in rural areas and stop the huge migration out to the urban areas. Since then, agritourism has spread around the globe, and there's a whole bunch of different definitions. I promise I won't go down the definition rabbit hole today. I'll just say that the core, where there's agreement, is on-farm experiences and product sales that are closely tied to agriculture. Then there's a bunch of things that sometimes people call agritourism, sometimes people don't consider it agritourism, and we won't get into that those definition controversies right now. But I will say that farms, ranches, vineyards, and aquaculture are all considered part of agritourism, and that there's often 5 different categories that people think of: hospitality, education, direct sales, entertainment, and outdoor recreation. Next slide, please. So just as agritourism is defined in many different ways, it's also measured in a lot of different ways. And these numbers are from an industry report, so not peer-reviewed journal research here. However, this was about 5 years ago. I saw the first industry report. You know, these are like, they try to charge you $5,000 for this industry report. That's who knows where it's done and who knows how it's put together. Lots of disclaimers there. But when I saw the first agritourism industry report, that was when I said, oh my gosh, agritourism has hit the big thing. They're the big time. They think they can make money selling an agritourism market report. Agritourism is a real thing now. According to this report, the global agritourism market is a little over 9 billion, and it's projected to grow at 12% per year, so doubling in the next 5 years to almost 19 billion. And they do break down different categories, and you know, they get a lot of their data from Expedia, Booking.com, online search engines, and travel agencies. And what really struck me is this market share by type of agritourism. Direct markets, so direct sales, 18%, while the experience part of it is over 80%. Keep that in mind as we move to the next slide.
10
So
minutes
on the
left,
next-
Lisa.
What's that?
You're halfway through, 10 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. So on this slide, this is USDA NASS Census of Ag data. So we can trust this much more, although by now it is about 5 years old. This is the 2017 census, and it's our best source of data, as limited as it may be. Take a look at this pie chart over here. You probably can't, yeah, you don't see my cursor when I move it because it's Chris's screen. So anyway, look at the pie chart on the right, and there you see that 75%, thank you, Chris, 75% of agritourism and direct sales by the USDA NASS Census of Ag definitions is direct sales. And only 25% is this experience piece, which is in sharp contrast to the global study that has over 80% being the experience piece. Over 150 producers around the country. Next slide, which is Vermont. So here in Vermont, we're looking at about 52 million, and that's direct sales and agritourism combined. And looking at that pie chart here in the upper right-hand corner, in Vermont, we've got 3% on the experiences. Almost all of it, 97%, is about the direct sales. Now, I will say the way that the census, I got to be careful of time and not go down my census rabbit hole, but the way the census counts the data, if you go to a wine, say you go to a vineyard, do a wine tour for free, and then you pay for tasting and maybe buy a case of wine, all of that money counts as direct sales, unless you specifically paid for the tour. The tour would count as the experience part, but oftentimes you're not paying for the tour. You know, you're going to do U-Pick, that's direct sales. You're going to a dinner on a farm, it's a dinner, it's the product, it's all direct sales. So it's it can be hard to separate the direct sales from the experience piece, the way the NASS Census of Ag measures it. But, you know, what my takeaway is, I think we've got a lot more potential to really grow the experience piece and grow it in a way that's beneficial, thinking about the pros and cons, that's beneficial for farms and educational for visitors, not something that's going to burn your house down. Next slide. So since the information we get from the census is really limited to number of farms involved in agritourism and direct sales and the revenue, we wanted to dig in a little deeper and understand more about what's going on with the producers who are generously opening their farms and vineyards to visitors. Next slide. So we conducted a survey. This was right before COVID. Coincidentally, we closed it on February 2020, not knowing what was about to happen. And we heard from over 1,800 respondents in all 50 states and 222 respondents from Vermont. Next slide. In the interest of time, I won't go into a whole lot of detail here, but Chris, we're going to start moving through the slides more quickly because I know Hans is going to give me a time check soon. So we'll just touch on some of the most interesting comparisons between Vermont and the rest of the US. And remember, these are farms that are open to visitors with agritourism experiences or direct sales. So the off-farm direct sales is not necessarily included here. Next slide, please.
5 minutes or a little bit more than 5 minutes.
So one big difference we found here in Vermont is our median farm size is a little larger than what we saw most other places around the country. And remember, these are farms open to visitors. So, you know, we're not surveying the big commodity farms here. And in terms of, so the USDA defines an urban area as 50,000 people or more. We don't have any of those urban centers. Even Burlington doesn't count. It's just a little under 50,000. So Vermont is more rural. Our farms are more rural and a larger size. Next slide, please. Looking at products. This is so as always, Vermont is the green and the United States is the sort of yellow gold color there. And these are bars looking at crops, animals, and value-added products. And the icon size is approximately that product. So as you can see under crops, way more maple in Vermont. And what really struck me though in this comparison is 73% of the farms we surveyed in Vermont had crops, 49% animals, 57% value added. You look at the US, every single number is lower. So what that tells us is that our farms in Vermont are just incredibly diversified, much more diversified than the farms, even those farms open to visitors that you see around the rest of the US. Next slide. Looking at types of farm experiences offered, much higher on the direct sales piece for Vermont, little higher on the lodging, and then a little lower on the outdoor recreation, education, and entertainment and events. Next slide. Here we're going to look at profitability, and this is talking about some of the downsides, some of the caveats of agritourism. No profit. In Vermont, 20% of the farms that are engaged in agritourism do not make an agritourism profit. Now, that doesn't mean they don't make a profit at all. It means specifically looking at agritourism revenues and agritourism expenses. 20% of our farms in Vermont have no profit. The number is 25% with no profit around the US. So it's, you know, while 80% of the farms in Vermont are making a profit here, it's really something to take a closer look at. And some of these farms think of it as a marketing event, expense. You know, I'm bringing people onto my farm for field trips, and then hopefully they're supporting the farm in other ways. But this is a major issue here. Next slide, please. So there's profitability aside, which is extremely important to 90% of the farms here in Vermont, even though only 80% are making a profit. There's a whole bunch of other motivations: building goodwill, educating the public, diversifying farm and ranch market channels, whole bunch of other reasons why people do agritourism. Next slide. And Chris, I think I'm getting a look from Hans, so we'll move a little quickly here. One of the big differences between Vermont and the rest of the US was looking at, this was a question of what do you anticipate for your farm in the next 5 years? And we saw that in Vermont, expansion. So the top arrows there are respondents planning to expand their services. Fewer in Vermont, still 60%, but fewer in Vermont than the rest of the US. Planning to invest more, planning to hire more employees. Those top green arrows, all lower in Vermont. And where you do see the big difference in Vermont is bottom left corner there. Almost a third, 31% of our respondents in Vermont are like, I'm good, I'm staying here. While in most of the rest of the US, they were looking much more towards expansion. And then the decrease, I want to get out of this, about the same between Vermont and the rest of the US. Next slide. So we asked farms about their challenges, and a lot of similarities in the challenges, pleased to see that by and large, our farmers feel a little better supported or a little less challenged than many of the others in the US, but still a lot of challenges for all of us to work on here in Extension. Next slide. And so
just at time, so we can wrap it up when you can.
Okay, support's needed. So this is my marching orders here in Extension. Marketing, legal and liability information, and safety. Big concerns around the US and also here in Vermont. Next slide. So then the question becomes, how do we address these concerns? We have a ton of resources online at this website. I can drop the link into chat. And we host events, trainings, and conferences. This is my last slide, Hans. The last slide, Chris. In less than 3 weeks from today, we are hosting an international agritourism conference, August 30th to September 1st. And I think Hans or someone can drop the link into chat. And we invite all of you to come. And really what I want to close with is to say that there's a very important role for UVM in terms of supporting the research and the outreach related to agritourism and tourism in general. And I think that part of the reason why I'm so excited to hear our next speaker, Pat Stokowski, is I think that collectively here at UVM, we can do a lot to work together and make sure that the tourism that we have on our farms and throughout our communities is the kind that warms our homes and bakes your bread and isn't the kind that burns your house down. And I'll close there.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And that was an amazing presentation, especially given I was bugging you every couple seconds. But really appreciate it. It gives a great overview. And yes, we're moving on to Pat Stokowski, and she is a professor and at the Rubenstein School and also director of the Parks, Recreation and Tourism program. An honor to have you here, Pat, and we look forward to your presentation. So you can start when you get up.
Thank you. Thanks very much, everybody. And thanks for inviting me to the presentations today, to the event today. This is pretty exciting to get to talk with people in another college and also who do, in many cases, some similar kinds of research. So I mentioned that you see from the slide that talk is about Imaginaries, and I want to start maybe not with that, with defining that concept, but with talking about very briefly that not only tourism, but parks and outdoor recreation and sports are really big and important in the state of Vermont. And there's, as you know from many of you, I'm sure from the context of the pandemic, there's increasing interest in people getting into the out of doors, and Vermont is seen as a very beautiful and cordial, nature-oriented, outdoorsy place, a place with a high quality of life, a place that is good for families and good to visit, and to some extent of great interest to us because it's also a place where people want to build second homes. And this may be of even more interest with the climate change issues that we might be experiencing in the next few years. So I want to go just quickly through to sort of orient myself so that you know why I'm talking about Imaginaries. So I direct the Parks, Recreation and Tourism program over here in the Rubenstein School. We've been established for, I don't know, 45 or plus years. We have about 50 majors and about 50 minors in the school, and we really teach in two areas. One is public sector recreation management, and the other is private sector tourism management. And you can see with the bullet points some of the classes we teach here. We teach some others, but those are some of the ones that are we find most useful for having a broad perspective on tourism and outdoor recreation and parks management in the state of Vermont, and also in work that's broader than Vermont, so across the US and even internationally. I want to, in a very brief moment, give you a couple of points about me, because it will show you how my research and Lisa's are complementary, but also dissimilar. I'm happy to announce that I came out of a College of Agriculture and Natural Resources at Michigan State University, and then I went on to a College of Forest Resources for my PhD at the University of Washington. I've been at UVM for about 25 years. I'm a qualitative researcher, so my interest is not particularly in survey research. I've done surveys, but I'm far more interested in sort of the processes of ideas and systems. And so my work is really in multidisciplinary social sciences. So I meet at the intersection of geography and sociology, rural sociology in particular, and anthropology. And this brings me to an unusual set of research questions, which here's a listing of some of the kinds of things I've worked on. And I maybe some of those are things that you are interested in as well, but my grad students and I have done work in all of these places and with all of these topics. We do have a pretty serious research program going on social media framing now, looking at national parks and regional parks. And over here on the left is Imaginaries. And that comes out of really a long-term project I did for 25 years or so that had to do with rural tourism development in some communities in Colorado. Here in Vermont, it's related to some of the rural community research I do, and also related to some of the national parks research that I've been involved in. So let's move on to Imaginaries now that you have the context. Several years ago, my research group was doing some work on rural community tourism in Vermont, and we were particularly interested with Burke as a case study. We had other case studies, but Burke was also an especially interesting one. We were interested in their tourism transitions because they seemed to be stumbling towards whatever future they wanted to have. And so when we first analyzed the data from a set of telephone interviews we had done with local people, there was nothing that was really interesting in it. And I mean by that the data showed what data show about every case study in tourism, that different groups of people have different ideas. Everybody's worried about the future. Everybody wants to have tourism dollars, but they don't want to have tourists, as Lisa pointed out. And they are interested in a vision. Each different set of people in the community is usually interested in a different kind of vision. Well, fast forward a little bit, we had been doing some other work on Imaginaries, and one day came back to the Burke study and said, oh, what we're looking at, what is really most interesting about this is the discourse of tourism development in Burke, not the actual actions, which are just the same as every other case study I've ever read, but the discourse. And so our analysis came to this point where we started looking at social, cultural, and spatial imaginaries. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But as we did that, it also became clear that we had to look at people's roles and positions locally in terms of growth and their the implications of the imaginaries and their positions for resilience as they develop for tourism. So, what are imaginaries? So the definition we have come to use as we've done this work over 4 or 5 years now is this. The different kinds of imaginaries, there are many, but broadly, social, cultural, and spatial imaginaries are discourses. They are social practices of language, signification, and meaning. And what imaginaries are collective discourses about how groups of people think. So I know that's a little bit conceptually vague maybe, but there are two main points in this. One, language is a social practice. So that's our fundamental basis here. Language is not just something people do on the side. Language is actually one of the fundamental practices of a development process. So one of the actions based on a development process. And imaginaries are the way people think collectively about the reality of the world. So those are the two main points. If you want to know what I would think an imaginary is, so here are a couple of examples of imaginaries. First of all, there are tons of imaginaries in politics. I am not going to give you any examples of that. You can think of all of them yourself, I'm pretty sure. A second example, this one's a real example. We had been doing some research about imaginaries at Acadia National Park. And when the National Park Service calls the night sky a new natural resource, that's an imaginary. That there's a whole discourse around that. I mean, not that sentence is an imaginary, but the whole discourse around the National Park Service sort of taking responsibility for managing the night sky because they call it a new resource. I mean, night skies, I think, if we think about it, are more than resources, but that's a kind of imaginary, a kind of collective understanding of how we're going to treat something in the world. Another example from a tourism example, in this project I had done in Colorado for years, people kept talking about our communities are dying, our communities are dying. And in fact, they were not. They were parallel exactly. If you looked at all the data, they paralleled exactly the state of economics in Colorado, broadly speaking. And so that imaginary, that set of conversations about how we are dying and we need help, is what we're calling imaginaries here. So imaginaries have been studied in the tourism literature. Here are a couple of examples on the first two entries here. Our contribution to the literature is really that we look at imaginaries as rhetorical claims, as claims that groups of people make in trying to persuade other people about the rightness of those meanings.
10 more minutes, Pat.
Thank you. I add to this a small note about that issue that you have to study people's roles and positions. I'm more than happy to talk about growth machine issues later, but they're not central. They're central in terms of how you sort out imaginaries later, but they're not central to other aspects of this talk. So I'll just put the note in here. If anybody's interested, please ask about that. The basic issue is that elites in communities try to manage the language, manage the discourse, and they do this in various ways, and that's what we're looking at. And so our work on the Burke study started from this proposition that imaginaries and growth machine politics were influencing the tourism trajectories in that community. So I'm going to skip right to the findings here and tell you that what we found was that what's in italicized text here, transformations of the local economy were accompanied by social, spatial, and cultural imaginaries in the town of Burke based on these interviews that we had studied. We found these at all stages of tourism development across all groups that we had studied. And we found that imaginaries were particularly salient at times of uncertainty. Here's an example of the data, just briefly. In the left-hand column, we studied three groups: community leaders, permanent residents, and second homeowners. In the second column, these were the discourses we uncovered, the imaginaries discourses. Community leaders spoke almost always about growth. permanent residents spoke about history, but not past history, really their history. Second homeowners spoke about utopia. Here are some examples in the third column, and I'll just point out that the ones I've highlighted in blue show you the differences in how people talked about the place and what was central to them about the place. So community leaders wanted to contrast Burke with fancy towns like Stowe. Permanent residents wanted to talk about how this was such a nice rural community. And second homeowners wanted to talk about Vermont and how Burke was the real Vermont. So even while they talked about different kinds of ideas in Imaginaries, all three groups centered around the symbol of the mountain, the ski mountain in Burke. Only they did it from different perspectives that slightly overlap. Certainly business and entertainment overlaps with tourism and jobs and a ski attraction. So that's, I won't say more about that rather complicated slide, but you have a little sense of what we're looking at. So when we look at these, we look for patterns in the discourses, and we found that there were not only unique perspectives, but there was overlap in the development goals of the community. I want to put up another slide here because I haven't mentioned two other important organizations that we didn't interview people from these organizations. Sorry, maybe from Burke Town Planning, but not from the resort. There are sources of text and discourses from these two groups, and the purpose of this slide is to show that they are going in totally opposite directions about their plans for the future of tourism growth in Burke. And so Burke Mountain Resort keeps talking about a quintessential Vermont village, which, by the way, is nothing at all like what Burke is. It's sort of this made-up fantasy land example. And Burke Town Planning talks about technological growth and innovation and commerce, but they say that they're really focused on rural character. So I'll skip the next slide. It's just a repeat, but the question here is really the one at the bottom of the page, which is who defines the future of this community when there are minimally 5 groups of people and organizations we've identified who don't seem to be aligned. And the answer is Kingdom Trails. Kingdom Trails is the mountain bike association that has worked to develop the work of community building across landowners in the community and mountain bicyclists who come there for this rather booming recreation activity.
5 minutes.
Thank you. The organizational leadership of Kingdom Trails has made it a point to find collaborators and to draw people together in some form of consensus about how the community should be and what the community should do in terms of tourism development. I can send you a reference to a commentary about that. There was a big article in, I think it was the New York Times, about the role of Kingdom Trails in that community. We had interviewed some people from Kingdom Trails, but it's become more prominent since our research. So the bottom line here is that this kind of work that that I've been doing with my research group is really about longitudinal studies across community development processes, community tourism development processes. I wrote a note here about Butler's destination life cycle model. This is like your basic bell curve model that says a community will start at the beginning and it will grow and expand as more tourists come, and it will be wonderful. And then all of a sudden everything will fail because people will be opposed to tourism and they just don't like all the tourists who are there. We actually think that what this research about Imaginaries does is it gives a slightly more nuanced understanding of that model, where a community really goes through many ups and downs even before it establishes itself as a tourism destination. And we believe that the way to understand tourism growth in communities is to look at the linkages between discourses of Imaginaries, growth machine, and the practices these places take for long-term resilience. So if you're interested, there's a journal article about this particular research, and here's the reference to it. And I'd be happy to send that or any other ones to you. I've put at the end of that PDF, I put a set of papers that we've had over the last few years. It's not so important, but in case anybody's interested. Okay, I think I made it.
You made it. You're perfect.
Okay.
And thank you so much. In fact, we're ahead of time, Pat, and that was a very amazing presentation that really does complement what Lisa's talking about, and brings up all of the issues of that every town and area probably in the state has that something like this, some kind of conflicting issues that come up in one form or another. So it's thank you for that. And we do have time for question and answer, and I know I have a couple questions, and feel free to drop any in the chat, and especially raise your hand is great. We can have a lively discussion here for the last 15 minutes or so before we go on our ways. So I see a couple hands up, Stefan, I believe, and let's see, or maybe that hand came down. Stephanie Hurley, you want to speak up? Hi.
Can you hear me? Great.
Sure can.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm also Stefan or Stephanie,
No,
but
there was another one.
Okay. Thank you both, Lisa and Pat. It's nice to see you. I have a question sort of embedded in a comment, just the absence of the term ecology or ecological from both of your presentations, and my sense that I also continually receive from my students in landscape design and planning context of this idea that being rural is closer to nature and part of the recreational benefit, and also the agritourism ideas are like representing the kind of farming that is closer to nature, perhaps, or closer to some like historic human roots in a more natural. I don't think there's a lot of people going to like CAFO dairy farms. They want to see like Bessie in the field with the bell, or, in the recreational context, you see the views of less developed things that are often flanked by mountains or water bodies or something. And I wanted your comments on the role of like ecosystems in both of your respective research areas.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Should I jump in?
Yeah.
Or do you want to go first, Pat?
No, go ahead, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, so I will say, we should do a study specifically looking at the types of farms that are open to visitors. And you're absolutely right. I mean, not only do visitors not want to go to the CAFO farms, they're not allowed. The types of farms that tend to, at least, what we see here in Vermont and by and large around the US, we do know they're smaller, small and medium-sized farms, tend to be more family farms, and tend to have a focus on sustainable practices, regenerative agriculture, ecosystem services, tend to be very conservation minded, as well as community minded. And I think you saw in one of the slides the question of, what are your goals with agritourism and with farming? And while they have to make ends meet, they need to have a reasonable source of income to be able to stay in business and maintain a viable farm. They tend to have multiple goals related to not just the economy, but also their community and the working landscape and sustainability. So I think you're absolutely right that that is a really big part of many of the farms that are open to visitors.
Hi, Stephanie, how are you doing? So thanks for your question. I think you're onto something important here, which is that I would call these comments that you made about the bucolic scenery and the beauty of the landscape and so on as imaginaries of the rural, imaginaries of Vermont, imaginaries of place that are really fostered in tourism development. And in literature about what Vermont is and who, and not only literature, but sort of the political context of what Vermont is and who we want to be and so on. And you're right, those kinds of imaginaries don't often talk about the fact that there are real people and real animals and real mud and real barns and getting up at 4 a.m. and taking care of the forest and so on. So the word ecology doesn't always show up. I mean, I presented a very small snapshot of the data, and I can assure you that the people we interviewed did talk about the landscape, and they talked about being farmers and working in the woods and so on. At least some of the people we talked to, and those were central to some of the groups, but not to all. And certainly second homeowners are not so, they are really interested in this imaginary of Vermont that does not involve cows and and ecology at its fundamental level. So I think you have a clear a point that sometimes this is what tourism is presented as, and it's not presented in the nuts and bolts of the working the land in a non-romantic way.
Thanks, Pat. We have I think, let's see, in the chat, Marie Follen, Pat, did your research influence or inform the community development process of Burke?
No, at the in that case, no. We were doing a series of comparative case studies, and we weren't we weren't actually there for the practical reason of being providing reports for the community. It was more a conceptual project that looked at processes of community development in a variety of resource places. I mean, some of this kind of work has influenced other communities, but not particularly Burke. No.
Great, thanks. And I had asked in the chat, the past 5 years, increasingly, we're seeing polarization of issues from both community and global levels, politics, whatever. Have you seen this play out in the sort of the drama around Imaginaries and that discourse? Is that something tangible that you have seen, sort of a trend in the recent future? And if so, comment on that, please.
Yep. We had done this research before the pandemic, and I mean, I think it was around 2015, if I recall. So it wasn't a longitudinal study where we went back and forth in the community multiple times. So I only have been able to follow sort of reports of the community, not panel studies or continual interactions with people there. Yeah, I mean, I would expect that there would be rather more bifurcated kinds of comments at this point in time. I think they would deal with a variety of different issues maybe as well, since Burke itself has changed rather dramatically over the last 5 or 7 years too. So.
Chris, you had a question in the chat. Do you want to just ask it? And then
I'll try. Yeah, I'm
Amelia,
not sure how
after
good my
that.
connection is, Hans, but I'll give it a shot. You able to hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. It's for Lisa Chase. Thank you both, Lisa and Patricia, for your presentations. Lisa, I was curious about the sort of overwhelming no profit response on the financial piece. And I wondered if there's any chance that that could be, you know, a lack of financial focus or a lack of record keeping specific to that farm enterprise, separate from other farm enterprises. Could it just be that the respondents didn't know whether there was a profit?
Absolutely. I mean, Chris, I know you're on farms a lot, talking to them, and not every farm loves QuickBooks. And, you know, we did ask questions generally about revenue and profitability, whole farm profitability, but then we asked them to specifically break out the agritourism piece. And there are plenty of farms that are not, may not have the data, may not have broken out the agritourism piece. There are also farms that maybe do their farm stand with cash, say, or, you know, a lot of their stuff happens with cash. And while and they may or may not be reporting it. And while we are not the tax collector or the auditor, I could understand them feeling uncomfortable putting some of that information, writing it down into a survey. So there could be some of the not knowing and some of the not wanting to report going on. In any case, though, I do, you know, those high percentages of 20% of no profit in Vermont and 25% in the US, like, it's definitely, that is a big question that we need to explore further and understand exactly what the reasons are. In some cases, you know, the farms may not be trying to make a profit through their agritourism. That may be sort of an additional thing with different motivations. But in other cases, I think there are, you know, real issues going on with the way they may be managing those enterprises that could be improved. So definitely, as a researcher, I got to say, definitely a question that needs more study.
Great,
Thanks so much.
Let's see, a couple more in the chat. Maria Poland, do you want to ask your question, or I can read it? I don't know if you're there.
Sure, yeah. Hi, Lisa. I was curious if you could just share your thoughts on how agritourism in Vermont might interact with food security, kind of like in a broad sense.
Yeah, I think one of the things that agritourism is very helpful for is keeping small farms, small diversified farms, in fact, incredibly diversified farms in business. Whether they're profitable or not, at least bringing in revenue for these farms. So to the extent that we end up with these very short supply chains, these, you know, direct to consumer supply chains, that's such an important piece of food security. And, you know, we saw it with the pandemic, when early on in the pandemic, you know, you went to Hannaford's and Price Chopper and there was no meat and there was no eggs. But then you could go to the farm stand or, you know, a co-op that's sourced locally, and there's meat and there's eggs, and you felt good about those products and you could trust it. So I think that agritourism, the direct sales, the relationships, the small farms, and that farm community connection is a hugely important part of food security in Vermont and around the globe. And I'm going to say food sovereignty is another big issue around agritourism. And we especially see this in Indigenous communities, where agritourism and the direct sales piece can be a very important incentive for continuing to produce heirloom crops and culturally important crops that may not have a big market through the commodity markets.
Great. Well, I am going to do a time check here. It looks like we've got some more questions rolling in, and we're just getting into some really interesting stuff. In other words, we probably could stay here another hour and start talking about some cool upcoming projects or things that could be done. So that actually is a bit of a leap. And I'm sorry to those, a couple questions here that may not get, yeah, we're not going to, we're out of time to handle these questions, but we should grab them. And what I would love to suggest is sometime in the future, you know, we have these out of the box sessions where we can carry on these conversations. And, you know, I'd love to, you know, what is this, what's a real great emerging research project that could combine some of these complementary things that you guys are up to, and what ideas do people have? Well, that would be a really great topic for an upcoming out of the box session, maybe early next spring or something like that. So anyway, I'm just going to throw that out, and we are out of time. And thank you all for taking the time out to jump in and hear this. And we got some the next ARS climate change food systems in September. There's going to be a exciting presentation by them where they're headed, probably followed by a brainstorming session as well. And then we're into economics and nutrition into the late fall. But yeah, it would be great to return to agritourism and recreation in the, to follow up with some deeper discussion, sort of out of the box ideas, and get some of that stuff on the table. All right, anything else? You can
yes, thank you very much to all of those who invited me, and thank you to the group. What an interesting group, and great presentation, Lisa, and fun to hear what you're doing to bring people together. So thank you.
Thank you all, both presenters. Excellent job, and feel free to see the recordings at Celsius Society, go.ubm.edu, Celsius Society, right here, and that will be posted soon enough, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.